Hey everyone, it's Anna and welcome back to my BookTube channel. This video is going to be my June wrap-up for 2025. This is also my wrap-up for the Queer Lit Readathon, which takes place for the whole month of June and which is all about reading queer literature. Although, of course, I do that all year round. I made a special effort to prioritize those reads as I was working my way through June. And in addition to that, I want to talk a little bit about some magazines I enjoyed and some video games I enjoyed, because they're very narrative based, and so I thought that would be cool too. So this month I read 10 books and 1 essay. I'm going to go through these in the chronological order in which I read them. And the first 2, I actually read most of these books in May, but I finished them in June, which is why I'm counting them as part of my June wrap-up. So the first one was The Thousand Crimes of Ming Su by Tom Lin. This one came really highly recommended from my husband, who read it, I think, a year or 2 ago, and he said it's one of his favorite books. So this is a Western that follows a Chinese American man, Ming Su, as he is going throughout the Western United States to try and get revenge on people that kidnapped his wife and separated the two of them. Along the way, he winds up falling in with this group of kind of magical or miraculous, maybe, circus performers, people who have powers or abilities that kind of defy reality. And there is definitely a strong dose of fantasy throughout this, while remaining firmly grounded in the historical reality of what it is to be Chinese or Chinese American in the American West. I really liked this book. I thought it was a really solid debut. I loved the nature writing in particular. Couple things that fell flat for me, though, is that there is a character in this book who's blind, and I swear the author could not write about this character without constantly drawing attention to his blind eyes, his sightless eyes, his eyes that couldn't see. Every single time it was like he had to call this out, and it was not only very jarring, but also really irritating, because I'm like, we get it. He's blind. We know. You don't need to keep bringing it up over and over again. So that was my main gripe, I guess, that I had with this book, is I was like, it's okay, we get that the character is blind, can we just move on with the story here? But I really hope that this author writes more books. I know he's in the midst of getting a PhD as well. I don't know how people can do that and write novels at the same time, but R.F. Kuang can do it, and apparently so can this guy, Tom Lin. So I hope he writes more novels. I will look forward to reading them if he does. All right, next up I read Alexei Navalny's memoir, which is titled Patriot. It was translated from the Russian by Arch Tate and Stephen Dalzell. This is a book that is a partial memoir, but also political autobiography of Alexei Navalny, who was the leader of the democratic opposition to Vladimir Putin's oligarchy in Russia. This is a book that he started writing before the attack that was the sort of assassination attempt where he was poisoned and had to be medically evacuated to Germany. And then it was concluded while he was in prison, which is ultimately where he died, and he was killed by the Russian regime. Published posthumously, that definitely adds a certain air of additional gravity to reading this book, as does the current political situation in the world, with authoritarianism on the rise in many different countries, not just Russia and not just the US where I live, but kind of all over the place. But this book was also incredibly humorous and funny, and I loved the way that he writes about his life, some of the stories that he tells about his childhood, or about the awakening that he had to become more politically involved, and his stories about being a young lawyer studying at a university and then also taking that to his political life. I would definitely recommend this very highly. This is going to be one of the books that sticks with me the most from this year. Got another memoir for you. This one I picked up from the library, and this is called Accidental Saints: Finding God in All the Wrong People by Nadia Bolz-Weber. This is actually kind of an old book. I didn't realize this book is 10 years old, but I had read Pastrix, which is her memoir more about her personal life and her becoming this sort of progressive oh my goodness, Lutheran? I need to make sure I get that correct. Yes, progressive Lutheran pastor. And this is kind of more of a pastoral memoir of her experience being the pastor of this church that she founds, the House of All Sinners and Saints. It was really good. Definitely some stuff in it that I could have done without. There's a lot of like ableism that can be baked into some sort of religious writing or religious narrative. But I really appreciate reading stories of like people's lives who are completely unlike my own. And yeah, like Christian pastor is pretty far removed from my everyday life. But I really enjoyed like getting to know both her and her own like emphasis on her imperfections and the imperfections that we all have, and how that makes all people living these like accidental saints where we can be holy and do good things and care for each other in spite of our flaws and our foibles. And it was a good read. I enjoyed it. Okay, now we're moving into the stuff that I intentionally started reading for the Queer Lit Readathon. Like I said, those I finished reading the very beginning of the month, and I had read most of them in May. So we have my first read for the Queer Lit Readathon, which is All the Painted Stars by Emma Denny. This is a queer sapphic romance that is set in the Middle Ages. It follows these two friends, Lily and Johanna, and they are both, for varying reasons, kind of thrown together in this tournament where Joanna's hand in marriage is the prize, and Lily has kind of gone undercover, disguising herself as this male knight in order to stop Joanna from being married off to a man that she does not love and also doesn't care about her. This book deals a lot with compulsory heterosexuality and the concept of lavender relationships. It also deals with like trans identity in the Middle Ages, and while I love that this is kind of a creative fictional imagining of what trans and queer identities could look like, I think it's really important that people remember these identities existed in the past, even if they didn't use the same verbiage or language to talk about it, that queer and trans people have always been here throughout history. This was very sweet. I definitely thought it was going to be a little bit more focused on the tournament aspect of the story. So I was kind of thinking it would have more of the Alana the Lioness vibe. If you've read the Tamora Pierce books, it's very similar. Young girl wants to be a knight, disguises herself as her twin brother so that she can, because girls are not allowed to become knights. But that is not really what most of this story focuses on. It's a lot about their relationship and them both like gradually realizing that the feelings they have for each other are not just friendly or close because they have relatives who are in relationships with each other. It's because they are actually falling in love. Very sweet. I definitely recommend. This next one is the critical essay that I read, so I didn't read this entire book, but the book is titled An American Girl Anthology, Finding Ourselves in the Pleasant Company Universe. It is edited by Justine Orlovsky-Schnitzler and K.C. Highsmith. And the essay that I read from this was, let me make sure I have the title, Interpreting, Imagining, and Inventing Queer Pasts and Futures Through American Girl, which is written by Laura Traister. This is a university press book, too. It's published by the University Press of Mississippi as part of their Cultures of Childhood series. And very briefly, for those of you who don't know, American Girl is a company that makes both dolls and accompanying historical fiction books of young girls that are set throughout various time periods in American history, or honestly pre-American history, since some of them are like indigenous people or live in what is now the United States, but what was then part of the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, etc., all the way up through to the present day. And this essay I was really excited to read because as somebody that loved these books as a child and who obviously grew up to be a queer adult, there was not a lot of like queer books for children that I was aware of or that I had access to as a kid. And so this has been interesting to kind of examine the way the adult, or presumably adult, like maybe teenagers and up, fandom of these dolls and books has imagined queer possibilities in history. One of my other kind of favorite bits about this is the American Girls podcast, which was co-hosted by Mary Mahoney and Allison Horrocks, and they both did this podcast. They're both public historians and best friends, and they did this podcast about reading all of the American Girl books or rereading as adults who have PhDs in history, and kind of giving them this sort of critical examination while also appreciating the imaginativity and playfulness of the books. And Mary herself is also a queer person. She runs an excellent Substack called Landline, and she's doing a similar 3-part series interviewing different people who work in the museum and archive space in imagining queer histories and kind of imagining queer stories into the archives, where they may not be explicitly described in those terms as I talked about, but where undoubtedly queer and trans people have always existed throughout history. So this was a really good read. I'm looking forward to the other essays in this book, but I'm not planning on sitting down and reading it cover to cover right away. So you'll probably hear some more about me dipping in and out of that. All right, so now we've gotten to the point of the month where I actually went to visit my family members from out of town, and I found this really old Nancy Drew Files book that must have belonged to me or one of my sisters. I'm not entirely sure who it was. It had to have been an old library book sale read with this incredible 90s cover. I mean, just look at that. Cool girl Nancy right there. This is case number 69, nice, Running Scared. And Nancy is going to Chicago with her friends Bess and George. George is going to be running in a marathon there, but the person who is supposed to be the star of the marathon, or the favorite to win it, I guess, has been receiving these threatening messages, and also has been targeted with different acts of sabotage or intimidation. So of course it's up to Nancy to solve the case before time runs out. It's too late. Somebody does something they'll live to regret. It's funny. There's a lot of very stereotypical 90s girl gender essentialism, where it's you are either the smart girl or the tomboy or the pretty girl who likes shopping and boys and stuff. And while I have such a fondness for Nancy in my heart of hearts and loved reading these books as a kid, it does make me roll my eyes as an adult, being oh my goodness, come on, don't write the female characters as so one-dimensional. But this was actually a decently set up and pretty solid mystery, specifically for kids, which is the target audience. So that was a fun little blast from the past I had. I took a couple other books with me on the trip. One of them was So Late in the Day, Stories of Women and Men by Claire Keegan. This was a book that I had bought new with a gift certificate that I was given by one of the families whose kids I've taught this past school year. And this is the last of the little, what is this edition called? These cute little, Grove Press hardcovers of Claire Keegan's books. And this is really more of a triptych. It's 3 interconnected stories about relationships between men and women. This is not going to make you feel good about the state of love and dating in the heterosexual world. I do feel like I somewhat dodged a bullet in that sense, being a queer person, but also I'm very sympathetic to the fact that there are people in all kinds of relationships who do not feel valued and supportive and fully realized as human beings by their partners. But this was very well written. It was definitely more of a slow, emotional read, but I sat on the couch by the beach and read it in one sitting. It was super awesome. And then finally, and those of you who have been watching me for a while will understand what a monumental achievement this is when I say it, I finally finished reading the Brother Cadfael mystery series by Ellis Peters. This is book 20, and yes, I read them all, Brother Cadfael's Penance. This is the final mystery in the series, and Ellis Peters, I believe, died shortly after completing the series, but it seems like this was the way that she always intended to end this. Spoiler alert for a book that's now probably like 30 plus years old, but this is a story that sees Cadfael traveling to the site of a truce between King Stephen and Empress Maud, who were the two warring factions in this English Civil War during the Anarchy period, 1100s roughly. He travels to the site of this truce in the hopes that he will be able to help negotiate the release of a certain hostage who is somebody who is very important to him from his past. And that's all I'm going to say about that, because if you have also read the series, you will likely know exactly who I'm talking about. And if you haven't read the series, there is quite a large gap in terms of the time when that important character is first introduced to when this book comes up. But it was a really great send-off for this character. I have to admit that I did not love every single book in this series. There were definitely some that seemed really more like Ellis Peters wanted to write historical fiction and then realized she had to try and find a way to shoehorn a mystery into there because that was the conceit of the series. And some of those seams really started to show, which I was not the hugest fan of. But again, the strengths of this series are in the way she draws the characters. And this was such a satisfying conclusion to Cadfael's story. I really am so glad that I toughed it out and stuck with reading some of the installments that I did not really care for, because it just worked out great. I'm very pleased with that. Okay, let's see. I think we have, yes, 2 more queer reads. So one of them is this graphic novel, but really it's a memoir. It's called Gaytheist, Coming Out of My Orthodox Childhood, with words by Lonnie Mann and art by Lonnie Mann and Ryan Gatz. This is an interesting book that is also the product of a queer couple, with Lonnie being the writer and artist, and his spouse Ryan also being one of the artists. But this is a memoir of Lonnie's childhood growing up in a very strict religious Orthodox Jewish community, while also being a queer person and trying to navigate his own identity and the way it brings him into conflict, not just with the gender and sexuality strictness of his religion, but also a lot of the expectations that his parents and his community have for him. Tread with care if you've got a lot of religious trauma, or if that kind of stuff is going to be stressful for you to read, because that's basically the entire book. But I really enjoyed it. This sort of limited yellow and blue color palette throughout was really great, because as Lonnie, the character, slowly becomes more comfortable with himself or begins to carve out space for himself to live his truth in the world, he's more surrounded by these little yellow bits. And eventually, sometimes the entire panel is a yellow backdrop. Whereas whenever he is more so having to hide his true self, or he's coming into conflict with the expectations of his religion and his family on him, it is mostly this dark, gloomy kind of blue shade. Really, really enjoyable. See, this is what I mean when I'm talking about this is him I-aming somebody that he realizes is also a fellow queer Orthodox Jewish boy, and the entire page backdrop is yellow. Then I read another mystery, which is Charlotte Isles is Not a Detective by Katie Siegel. This is the first in a series, and it came out a couple of years ago. I remember hearing about this when it came out and being interested, because the premise is that Charlotte is a former child sleuth, a precocious young kid who solved mysteries in her neighborhood and her community, but she's kind of left all of that behind to try and figure out who she is as an adult, until she has to come out of retirement to solve this mysterious case. And I thought that that concept was really intriguing. I didn't realize this was also a queer book when I got it out of the library, but I was very delighted to see that. Charlotte herself is a bisexual character, and in one of my favorite things, this book has queer characters being friends with other queer people, which is awesome because sometimes you can tell, like, it's either very tokenizing or the author themselves is not queer because they just have like a queer character who has no queer friends. So there are other queer and trans characters in this story. I really liked it. I thought it was quite funny. And then another thing I didn't realize about this book is that it is apparently based off of the author's like short form TikTok web series, I guess she did, that she created this character for. And I am not on TikTok, nor have I ever really had a positive experience with so-called like TikTok books, either books that became popular because of that platform or because the author like came up with a web series or another creative idea that started as TikTok videos and then migrated over to being a book. So honestly, I'm kind of glad I didn't know that because I am biased against that at this point. I've had too many bad experiences and I might have second-guessed my choice to pick this up, but I'm super glad I did. The second book is called Charlotte Iles is Not a Teacher. I'm definitely going to be reading that. I would recommend this if you are a fan of mysteries, and it kind of toes the line between like coziness but with actual stakes, if you know what I mean. And then the last book that I finished this month, on the very last day of June, was another mystery, Fair Play by Louise Hegarty. This book kind of broke my brain a little bit. It was a really bizarre experience reading it because I thought when I picked it up at the library it was going to be a more straightforward locked room mystery, and it's not. It starts out seeming like it's going to be that way, but it quickly becomes very clear that there is a lot of like metafiction going on in addition to the mystery that is introduced at the beginning of the book. I don't want to give too much away about the structure of the book because I really feel that that is the strength of the experience of reading this book, is sort of the formal interplay that the author does. But what I did like about this book is the way in which it exposes some of the like troubling narrative that if you think a little bit about mysteries too much, you can't help but ignore. And what I mean by that is that every death, you know, every mysterious circumstance, every crime has sort of this neat and tidy way that you can explain and narrativize it and get perfect closure in like 300 pages tied up with a bow, that type of thing. When in real life, that's frequently not how death and grief works, especially if somebody dies under shocking or like suspicious circumstances. This book also does come with a big trigger warning for like a lot of discussion about suicide. It doesn't really go into great detail, but it's definitely like a major theme of the book is like whether the death that takes place in this book is a suicide or not, and then what that means for the people that are left behind after the dead person has passed. So keep that in mind, but I really enjoyed this book. This was another book that I'm kind of glad I didn't know a lot about going into it, because when I went to go put it on Goodreads that I was reading this, I saw that it had kind of a low rating, and that doesn't normally affect my choice to read a book or not, but I did think it was interesting because it was right around the 2.7, 2.9 out of 5 range, and I was like, that's weird. So either this book is kind of bad pretty consistently, or it's kind of controversial and divisive. So I clicked and like went to the page where you can see the reviews and kind of the distribution of the ratings from 5 to 1. And it was a perfect bell-shaped curve with the apex at the 3 and then like a smaller smatterings of 4s and 2s and then the smallest 5s and 1s at the end. I will say, full disclosure, I landed more on the positive recommendation side of the bell-shaped curve, but I completely understand why this book isn't for everyone. If you are looking for a more traditional cut and dry locked room mystery, this is not going to be that. However, if you like mysteries and if you're interested in reading books that play around with form within the genre, I would really recommend this. I thought this was great. I thought it was honestly a lot better than a lot of the metafictional mysteries that are getting like more popular in recent years. So that was how I felt about that. Whew, that was a lot of books. Okay, I will try and keep the other bits and pieces short, but it will probably not surprise you at this point to hear that it wasn't enough for me to read mysteries only. I also had to go play a bunch of detective games. So you may have seen this if you were watching my video game streams that I was doing a while ago, but I am a big fan of the Nancy Drew point and click mystery adventure games. This spans basically the late 90s, really to the early to mid 20-teens is what I would say the heyday of those games were. But these sort of early to mid 2000s games were peak childhood memories for me. So I decided to go download some of them on Steam and play the ones that I didn't play as a kid because I did not have infinite access to all the games on CD, but then also replay the ones that I did. And some of them hold up surprisingly well, others not so much, but I definitely have been enjoying that recently. I played games 1 through 6, I want to say, except for 2 because you can't find it digitally, and I'm not really that interested in going and trying to recreate my ability to play it on disc. That's fine. I'll just live with the memories, but that was really enjoyable. And then I have 2 other things that I have been reading, not about mysteries this time, but both about books. One of them was that I finished the most recent issue of O Reader, which is a magazine that is basically essays about people who love books and reading. I think some of my favorite essays in this one were Why This Black Woman Loves Jane Austen by Avis Yarborough, about her experience reading Jane Austen, and not only not represented in the fiction of the stories, but also not who we stereotypically might think of as a fan of Jane Austen's literature. And I also really, really loved the essay that was about the most beautiful bookish places in the world. Apparently Portugal is the place to go. This is a picture that is actually from a bookshop in China, but the other really awesome, smaller pictures are of one of the famous streets in Portugal that's covered in bookstores. Who knew? I didn't know that. That's pretty cool. And then the next and final thing here is my copy of Fine Books and Collections, which is a magazine that is about fine books and collecting things. I think this comes out, I want to say 4 or 5 times a year, something like that. And it was pretty cool because there was an article that is about if books could kill, which is books that are made out of poisonous or otherwise deadly materials. Here is a picture of one of those books in there. And this exhibit was actually on display at a museum that's not too far away from where I live. So if I can find a link to the exhibit catalog or something like that, I'll put it in the description. But we actually went and drove to the museum, saw the books. They were super cool. I was very intrigued by all of the ways in which people came up with ingenious reasons to use really, really, really dangerous and toxic pigments to decorate their books. Of course, at the time, it's not like they knew that lead and arsenic and mercury were going to poison you and cause pretty serious issues for you, but it was still really cool to get to see how the curators and conservators worked with those books, worked to preserve and display and study them without themselves getting poisoned. So, with all that being said, this video is going to be ridiculously long, but I hope you enjoyed watching it. If you're not subscribed to my channel, but you had fun watching this one, go ahead and give me a subscribe. That way, theoretically, you'll be able to get notified every time I post a new video. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.